slide open a 1963 spice cabinet. What you see, a narrow row of tin-lidded glass jars labeled in perfect mid-century typography, stacked two deep on a shelf above the electric range, will tell you more about the era than any cookbook, any television commercial, any glossy magazine advertisement ever printed. That cabinet is a cultural document, a time capsule no one meant to leave behind. Each jar a small decision, a small loyalty, a small story about where America had been and where it was cautiously, hopefully, beginning to go. The jars are short, barely 4 inches tall. The glass is thick and faintly green at the base, pressed in factories that had, a decade earlier, made jars for wartime rations. The metal caps are screw-top, often printed in red, or deep forest green with a little gold foil script. The labels are paper, glued on with a wheat paste that yellows and peels at the corners by 1968. Run your thumb across one and you feel the waxy finish that mid-century printers used to protect the ink from kitchen steam, a particular slickness that baby boomers still remember without being able to name. Inside those jars is where the real story lives. The American spice cabinet of the early 1960s was the most transitional little shelf in the whole history of the American kitchen. It held the last remnants of the Victorian pantry, the cautious additions of the post-war years, and the first whispers of the global pantry that was still, by 1963, a decade or more away. It held jars opened in 1954 that would not be emptied until 1971. It held the ghost of every Sunday roast, every church supper casserole, and every nervous experiment with something called oregano that a neighbor had mentioned at a bridge party. Let us slide that cabinet open, jar by jar. Let us read the labels. Let us smell what the American housewife smelled when she reached past the flour canister at 5:30, with the meatloaf already in the oven. Let us meet the companies that stocked those shelves and the silent hierarchy of flavor that governed American dinner from roughly 1958 to roughly 1972. Begin, as most of those cabinets did, with McCormick. The jar is unmistakable. Red cap, white label, blocky serif lettering, and a little shield that reads, in small gold print, Baltimore, Maryland, since 1889. That is not a marketing slogan. That is a fact. Willoughby M. McCormick founded the company in a single rented room in Baltimore in 1889, selling root beer extract, fruit syrups, and a handful of household flavorings door to door. He was 25 years old. He had a mustache and a ledger and a habit, employees later recalled, of tasting every single batch himself before it went out the door. By the time Willoughby died in 1932, McCormick was the largest spice company east of the Mississippi. By 1963, it was the largest spice company in the world. That jar in that cabinet, whether it held black pepper, or ground ginger, or celery salt, was the direct descendant of a Baltimore basement and a young man with a ledger. The second jar, likely sitting beside the first, bears a different logo, a mortar and pestle, a banner reading Schilling, and the same red and white color scheme. Most shoppers in 1963 did not know that Schilling had merged into McCormick 16 years earlier, in 1947. The brands were kept separate for a simple reason. Schilling was the West Coast brand, beloved from Denver to San Diego, and McCormick was the East Coast brand, beloved from Boston to Atlanta. For decades, a California housewife would swear by Schilling, and an Ohio housewife would swear by McCormick, and neither one realized they were reaching for the same corporation. It was one of the quietest dual-brand strategies in American grocery history, and it worked because both jars, in truth, contained the same Baltimore blended product after 1947. Now, pause. Look up from the cabinet. Listen. Somewhere down the block, a screen door is slamming. A transistor radio is playing Patsy Cline. A Ford station wagon with wood grain paneling is idling in the driveway. The smell drifting from the kitchen window next door is pot roast. Onion-heavy, bay leaf-laced, simmered since noon. Hold it in your mind as we reach for the next jar. Here is Spice Islands. Founded in 1941 in San Francisco by two men named Clyde Tanner and Wayne Cady, Spice Islands was the premium brand, the one a serious home cook bought when she wanted something a little more exotic, a little more worldly. The jars were squatter than McCormick's, with black caps and a globe and schooner logo that hinted at far-off harbors. Tanner and Cady had started the company with a simple idea that American cooks, returning from a world war, wanted spices that felt like travel. By 1963, a jar of their curry powder, or their fine herbs, on your shelf signaled that you read the food section of the newspaper and perhaps subscribed to Gourmet magazine. It was, quietly, a class marker. Beside those three name brands, in nearly every cabinet, sat a flat yellow and red shaker of Lawry's seasoned salt. The can was tall, cylindrical, with a flip-top perforated cap and a retro graphic of a chef's hat that had not been updated since the Truman administration. Lawry's was the creation of Lawrence Frank, Larry Frank to history, who in 1938 was running a prime rib restaurant in Pasadena, California called Lawry's The Prime Rib. He had developed a seasoned salt blend to sprinkle on his rib roasts, tableside. Salt, sugar, paprika, turmeric, onion, garlic, and a small proprietary handful of other things. And diners began asking if they could take a can home. By 1941, Larry Frank was selling Lawry's in tins. By 1963, it was ubiquitous. On hamburgers, on French fries, on deviled eggs, on roast chicken, on the rim of a Bloody Mary at a Saturday cookout. The particular aroma of a Lawry's can being opened, that first sharp puff of paprika and celery and something else, is the smell of mid-century American backyard cooking, compressed into a single tin. Reach deeper into the cabinet. There, behind the Lawry's, is a smaller shaker, white, with a red cap and the single word accent in a jaunty italic. This is monosodium glutamate, pure MSG, and by 1963 it was in roughly half of American kitchens. Accent had launched in 1947 and was marketed not as a seasoning but as a flavor enhancer, a small shake of invisible magic that made beef taste beefier and tired leftovers come alive. Housewives sprinkled it into pot roast, meatloaf, pan gravies, tuna salad. Nobody in 1963 had any concerns about it whatsoever. The famous backlash was still 2 decades away. For now, accent was the secret weapon, the thing that made a Tuesday casserole taste like a Sunday one. Breathe in. Hold that thought. There is a particular hush that falls over a 1960s kitchen at 4 in the afternoon. The children are not home yet. The husband is not home yet. The roast is in. The radio is low. The house smells faintly of warm metal and warm meat and the dry, sweet wood of the cabinet itself. Spice cabinets in those years were often built into the wall between the fridge and the stove, a little recessed alcove with a wooden door on a brass hinge. Opening that door released a smell entirely its own, paprika and sage and allspice and old paper mingled in the still, warm air. If you grew up in that decade, you know exactly what I'm describing. Now, the paprika. Every cabinet had it. A squat jar, label faded to a soft rose, Contents a dusty brick red. In 1963, paprika meant one thing: sweet Hungarian. Not smoked, not hot, not pimenton. Sweet Hungarian, ground fine, with that gentle, earthy perfume that announced itself on stuffed peppers, on deviled eggs, on top of potato salad at a church picnic. American cooks did not, as a rule, cook with paprika. They finished with it. The faded red of paprika on stuffed pepper tops is one of the signature visuals of mid-century home cooking. That muted coral crust, slightly sticky from the melted cheese beneath. In most households, that jar of paprika had been purchased in 1959 and was still more than half full in 1965. Paprika was aesthetic before it was culinary. Next to it, the sage. Rubbed sage, in a jar that was opened twice a year, once at Thanksgiving, once at Christmas. Sage was the smell of stuffing. Nothing else in American home cooking used it. Not pasta, not soup, not breakfast sausage at home, not roast chicken. Just stuffing. A teaspoon of dried rubbed sage in a bowl of cubed white bread and melted butter and chopped celery and chopped onion and a raw egg. That was the single annual ritual of the sage jar. By the time the jar was empty, a child born the year it was purchased was often old enough to read the label. And then poultry seasoning. Oh, the poultry seasoning. In a 1963 cabinet, that bottle was almost guaranteed to be older than the cabinet itself. Poultry seasoning is a blend: sage, thyme, marjoram, rosemary, black pepper, sometimes nutmeg, and it was used for one purpose only, which was to be shaken into the same Thanksgiving stuffing that already contained the rubbed sage. One bottle lasted, in the average American household, between 8 and 15 years. Surviving estate inventories from the 1970s list poultry seasoning jars with price stamps reading 39 cents, suggesting a purchase date somewhere in the early Eisenhower administration. When the housewife finally threw that jar out, it was not because it was empty. It was because it no longer smelled like anything at all. Pause again. Listen. A telephone is ringing somewhere in the house. It is a rotary phone, mounted to the wall, beige. It rings with a mechanical bell, not a tone. The housewife will answer it with a dish towel still in her left hand. The cord is long enough that she can stir the gravy while she talks. The spice cabinet stays open behind her, exhaling its faint brown sugar and bay leaf breath into the room. Now, dried parsley flakes. A tall, thin jar of pale green confetti, and in 1963, this was parsley in the American home. Fresh parsley existed only as a garnish sprig at restaurants. In the home kitchen, parsley came in flakes, and it was shaken generously onto buttered noodles, into cottage cheese, over the top of a tuna casserole before it went into the oven. The flakes themselves tasted, frankly, of almost nothing. A whisper of hay, a hint of green. But the visual was the point. A shake of parsley flakes said the cook cared. It said presentation mattered. It said, this is not a weeknight, this is a meal. Garlic powder, ascending. In 1963, it was in roughly 3 of 4 households, and its presence was still, in some quarters, slightly controversial. Fresh garlic was considered ethnic, Italian, Greek, maybe Jewish, but not mainstream American. Garlic powder, however, was acceptable, neutralized, safe. A little shake. Into the meatloaf, a sprinkle on garlic bread made with margarine and white sandwich loaves. The rise of garlic powder between 1955 and 1965 is, in miniature, the rise of American comfort with flavors that its grandparents had actively feared. Onion powder sat right beside it. Same short jar, same red McCormick cap. Onion powder was cheating and everyone knew it, and nobody cared. A teaspoon into the hamburger patty, a sprinkle into the tuna salad, a shake into the cream of mushroom soup base that held together half the casseroles in the country. Onion powder was speed. It was modernity. It was the promise that you no longer had to chop, cry, scrape, and scrub. You could simply shake. Dill weed, in a small green-labeled jar, was a 1960s rising star. Craig Claiborne had mentioned it in his New York Times food columns. Claiborne, who from 1957 onward had been quietly, steadily teaching American readers the names of herbs and spices their mothers had never purchased. Dill weed went into tuna salad, into cucumber sandwiches, into sour cream dips for the cocktail hour. Dill seed, a separate jar, went into pickles, into potato salad, into rye bread. That mid-century cabinets often held both forms tells you how seriously that era took pickling. Pause once more and listen. Somewhere, a refrigerator hums. The Frigidaire, turquoise, the handle chrome. Inside, a half-empty bottle of milk in a glass jar, a block of Velveeta, an iceberg lettuce, a small square of leftover Sunday ham wrapped in wax paper. The oven light is on. The kitchen clock, the black and white General Electric starburst clock on the wall above the sink, reads 4:47. The roast needs 13 more minutes. Cumin. Here is where the story begins to turn. In 1963, cumin was just entering the American mainstream. It had been in Tex-Mex cooking along the border for a century, but it did not appear on the average Iowa spice shelf until the chili con carne craze of the early 1960s. Chili had become a national fixation. Wolf Brand, Hormel, Chef Boyardee. The housewife who wanted to make chili from scratch found herself staring at a recipe that called for cumin, bought a small jar, tucked it into her cabinet, and it changed, slowly and forever, the way her kitchen smelled. Cumin has a particular warmth, low, dusty, smoky, without smoke. And once it is in a spice cabinet, it rarely leaves. That 1963 jar of McCormick ground cumin is the first brick in the long bridge between Anglo-American cooking and the global pantry that would finally arrive in the 1980s. Oregano. Here is a spice with a documented arrival date. Oregano did not exist in American home kitchens before World War II, entirely unknown. Then 2.5 million American servicemen shipped out to Italy, North Africa, and the Mediterranean between 1943 and 1945, and ate the cooking of those places for weeks, months, years. They came home wanting pizza, they wanted spaghetti, they wanted tomato sauce with the herb that smelled like the little Czech tablecloth trattoria in Naples, where they had eaten during the war. That herb was oregano, and between 1946 and 1960, American oregano consumption rose by roughly 5,200%. A 1963 cabinet without oregano was the cabinet of someone who had never fed a returning GI, and there were very few such cabinets left. Celery seed. Here is where a modern viewer might pause. Celery seed? Yes. In 1963, it was in nearly every American cabinet. It flavored potato salad, coleslaw, Bloody Marys, the brine of refrigerator pickles, the dry rub on pot roast before browning. Celery seed was part of the American savory vocabulary, to tiny, bitter crunch that reminded every bite someone was paying attention. Today, it has nearly vanished from home kitchens. Ask a 30-year-old in 2026 where the celery seed is, and you will get a blank look. In 1963, it was as standard as salt. Mace, almost forgotten now. Mace is the lacy red aerial that grows around a nutmeg seed, dried and ground. more delicate than nutmeg, brighter with a hint of pepper. Mid-century cookbooks called for it constantly. Betty Crocker recipes for donuts, pound cake, cream sauces, fish chowder. The jar in a 1963 cabinet was often a remnant, purchased for one recipe, kept forever, its orange-brown powder slowly going flat. By 1990, most American home cooks could not have told you what mace was. Willoughby McCormick had sold it by the barrel, cardamom. In a Scandinavian-American household, Minnesota, the Dakotas, the Wisconsin Shore, cardamom was in the cabinet, and it was not a remnant. It was a weekly tool. It went into coffee bread, into Christmas cookies, into Pula and Kringle and Krumkake. A Swedish grandmother in Minneapolis in 1963 had cardamom pods in a jar and ground them fresh in a small brass mortar. An Italian grandmother in Providence did not. A German grandmother in Milwaukee might or might not. The spice cabinet was, in this sense, an ethnic map of America, drawn in dried herbs. Stop, listen, feel, the roast is out. It rests on a platter under a tent of foil. The gravy is being made from drippings and flour and a splash of something brown from a bottle shaped like a little barrel. The housewife is humming. Her apron has a stain on the hip from the cornstarch slurry that slipped earlier in the week. The cabinet is still open. Caraway. In the rye bread households, the cabbage and sausage households, caraway was present. German American, Czech American, Polish American, Irish American to a lesser degree. Caraway went into sauerkraut, into colcannon, into boiled cabbage with butter, into the seeded rye loaf from the bakery on the corner. If your grandmother was one of those women, you remember the smell, slightly medicinal, slightly licorice, entirely warm, allspice. A small jar, usually whole berries rather than ground. And in 1963, allspice meant one thing in the American mainstream: pickling. Bread and butter pickles, watermelon rind pickles, pickled peaches, pickled beets. A tablespoon of whole allspice went into the brine, and that was essentially the only time the jar came out. Jamaican jerk cooking, where allspice is the soul of the cuisine, was entirely unknown to mainstream American households. That would not arrive until the late 1980s. For now, the little jar of allspice berries sat in the back of the cabinet for 11 months of the year and came out in September when the cucumbers came in. The sharp bite of 10-year-old allspice, a jar opened in 1953 and finally emptied in 1964, is a smell that every pickling grandmother knew. Faded, a little dusty, still sharp enough at the nose to make you flinch. Cream of tartar. Not a spice exactly, but it lived in the spice cabinet. A small red and white McCormick jar, essential twice a year. Once when the angel food cake was made, once when the meringue was whipped. In an era when every housewife made angel food cake for birthdays, the jar was non-negotiable. It also cleaned copper pots, which a surprising number of households still owned. Vanilla extract. Here, a confession. In 1963, most American vanilla was imitation. Real vanilla extract existed. McCormick sold it, Schilling sold it, Spice Islands sold it. But the bottle in the average cabinet was labeled imitation vanilla flavor. And it was made from vanillin synthesized from wood pulp. It was cheaper. It was stronger. It tanned the batter a deeper brown. And for an entire generation of Americans, the taste of their mother's chocolate chip cookies was, in fact, the taste of imitation vanilla. And when they grew up and switched to real Madagascar extract, they often reported, quietly, that it tasted wrong. Memory is a stubborn seasoning. Whole cloves, stuck into the Easter ham in a diamond-scored pattern. 1 clove per diamond, 30 cloves studded across the surface before the brown sugar and pineapple juice glaze was poured over. Cloves also went into mulled cider at Christmas, into pickled peaches in September. The jar was tiny. The cloves looked like little black nails. A child who bit into one by accident never forgot the experience. Bay leaves always last in the spice cabinet because they were always added first to the pot. Whole bay leaves, dried to a pale sage green, brittle at the edges. 1 or 2 in the pot roast, 3 in the stewed tomatoes, 1 in the pot of dried navy beans that simmered all Saturday. Every cook knew, fish them out before serving. Some cooks knew, do not forget them in the pot. A bay leaf chewed whole is one of the less pleasant experiences in mid-century cooking. And then the blends. The housewife's own custom shaker, a small glass repurposed jar with a shaker lid, filled with her personal proportion of paprika, garlic salt, and sometimes a pinch of dried oregano, sat on the counter, not in the cabinet, and got shaken onto nearly everything. Paprika garlic salt was the signature house seasoning of millions of American kitchens. Every cook's proportions were slightly different. Every cook believed hers were correct. And there were the liquid seasonings. They did not quite fit the cabinet. They sat on a separate shelf near the canned goods. Lipton's beef base, a brown jar of concentrated paste, spoon dissolved into boiling water for instant beef broth. Kitchen Bouquet, a browning sauce in a small brown bottle with a yellow label, nothing but caramel color and vegetable essence, a few drops of which turned pale gravy into the deep mahogany that mid-century Americans believed gravy should be. Gravy Master, Kitchen Bouquet's competitor, nearly identical in purpose, beloved by its own loyal faction. Weiler's chicken bouillon cubes, small gold foil squares in a red and white box, dissolved into rice, dropped into soup, crumbled into casseroles. Between those 4 products, an American home cook in 1963 could manufacture the flavor of long-simmered broth in about 90 seconds. And she did, constantly, without apology. Now, close the cabinet. Let it click shut. Step back. Look at the little shelf we have just walked through. McCormick from Baltimore, still run by descendants of Willoughby. Schilling from the West Coast, quietly the same company. Spice Islands, Tanner and Katie's dream of culinary travel. Lawry's, Larry Frank's restaurant salt turned national phenomenon. Accent doing invisible work. Paprika for color. Sage for stuffing. Poultry seasoning, ancient in its jar. Parsley flakes for garnish. Garlic powder rising. Dill weed and dill seed. Cumin just arriving. Oregano, the soldier's souvenir. Celery seed about to fade. Mace, almost gone. Cardamom, where Scandinavia had settled. Caraway, where Germany had. Allspice for the pickle jar. Imitation vanilla, unapologetic. Whole cloves in the Easter ham. Bay leaves always last. That cabinet is not just a cabinet. It is a photograph of a country in transition. A country that had just finished a war, that was cautiously opening its pantry to the world, that still cooked from its grandmother's recipes, but had started nervously and with great interest, reading Craig Claiborne in the Sunday Times. A country whose kitchens smelled of paprika and sage and the faint metallic tang of an electric range on its second decade of service. Those jars are mostly gone now, dumped during remodels, donated in estate sales, replaced with modern bottles labeled in typefaces that would have looked alien in 1963. The brands endure. McCormick still dominates, Lawry's still sells, Spice Islands still exists, but the shelf itself, with its quiet hierarchy of loyalties and memories, is gone. unless you find one, in an aunt's house, in an estate sale in a small Midwestern town, in the back of a cabinet that no one has fully emptied since 1971. Pull the jar out. Run your thumb across the label. Feel the waxy finish. Open the cap. Smell what the woman who bought that jar smelled when she reached past the flour canister at 5:30 on a Tuesday evening, with the meatloaf already in the oven. That is history in a spoonful. That is the cultural memory of an entire country distilled into a single small glass jar. Here, then, is your invitation. Walk into your own kitchen tonight. Look at your own spice cabinet. Notice what is there and notice what is missing. Then go to a store. Any store, a supermarket, a specialty shop, even an old-fashioned pharmacy if you can find one that still carries McCormick. And buy one spice you have never used. Not a blend, a single spice. Mace, perhaps. Or celery seed, or whole allspice berries, or cardamom pods if you have Scandinavian blood anywhere in your tree. Pick up the jar, pay for it, bring it home, then cook with it tonight, not tomorrow, not next weekend. Tonight. A pinch of mace in your mashed potatoes. A teaspoon of celery seed in your coleslaw. 4 whole allspice berries dropped into a pot of simmering apples. Taste what you have made. Close your eyes. That is how 1963 tasted. And the cabinet is waiting to be reopened, one jar at a time.